Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Hynes. I'm Curator of Film, Museum of the Moving Image, and I welcome you to the second weekly Reverse Shot Happy Hour. It is my great pleasure to bring this to you all, and we hope that you're out there paying attention and visiting us again. If it's your first time, welcome. This is the Zoom version or Zoom variation or attachment or extension of Reverse Shot, the journal of Museum of the Moving Image that's been around since 2003. But we are so happy to have you join us here for this session. I just want to quickly say, as from the museum, we are so happy to have you here, and we're also very, very grateful if you have been participating in any of our online events to date, and especially if you've been offering any kind of help to us through our fundraising efforts for these events. We're doing event after event because we really believe in the mission of the museum to bring presentations and discussions around the moving image throughout this time, and to continue to innovate in terms of what we could provide in terms of online programming. But we really, really appreciate any help that you can give to us for these events. And so I'll be back further on for a little bit more about what's going on at the museum. But in the meantime, I'd love to introduce the hosts of Reverse Shot Happy Hour, the editor and founders of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky and Jeff Reichert, and longtime contributor and filmmaker, Farihah Zaman.
Hey, Eric.
Hello.
Thank you for that intro. I like being.
I think we've lost Jeff Reichert.
It says movie lover. I think he goes by movie lover now.
There he is, movie lover. Great, Jeff. I appreciate you're making things as simple as possible for me.
Hi, guys.
You're such a mystery, Jeff.
Movies are all right.
See you guys in a little bit.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being here. As Eric mentioned, they're doing all these events to help support the museum in this difficult time. And, if you, feel it in your heart to help support the museum, that actually supports Reverse Shot too. And I think there is probably a link that Tomoko or somebody from the museum could pop in the chat where they are accepting donations for this kind of work that they're doing, which we think is really great, really important. Before we dive in, we wanted to just do a little quick housekeeping. I think most people probably know who and what Reverse Shot is at this point. We have a movie out right now called Feast of the Epiphany, which you haven't seen yet. It's screening in a number of virtual cinemas across the country, including as a benefit for the Museum of the Moving Image. So if you rent the film by the Museum of the Moving Image, all of the proceeds, all the ticket proceeds go to support their work. It's also screening in Los Angeles, Columbia, South Carolina, a small town in Pennsylvania. And we're going to be doing more virtual cinema engagements over these weeks. It's a way to help kind of support theaters, essentially. Theaters are not open in most places in the country right now. And so they are taking these virtual cinema engagements to get some revenue in and give them a reason to communicate with their customers and let them know, what kind of movies are out there right now. So it's an exciting program. It's not great that we have to do it, but we're excited to have Feast of the Epiphany as a participant in that in different theaters across the country. And we have a page at Reverse Shot where you can find out what theaters it's playing. So that way, if you wanted to support Laemmle Theaters in Los Angeles, California, you could rent a ticket there.
So this is our second ever Reverse Shot Happy Hour. We've been talking about how it would be nice to have a theme each week. And as this week came together, it was inspired a lot by the guests that we ended up having, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but also something that's been on our minds in general. There are some things happening in the world. So the theme for this week is labor. And there's a lot of ways to interpret that word. And it's a very open and all-encompassing sort of word for something that undergirds how all of our society functions. I think that because of the ways in which our economy shifted, because of COVID, because of staying home, it's a strange time in which all of the flaws in every system are showing. All of the things that weren't quite working before are exposed. Like what are for-profit systems that maybe shouldn't be for-profit systems, like healthcare and prisons and detention centers that continue to function during an actual pandemic. We also have started thinking about more, I hope. I think that the potential positive shift is going back to or reconsidering forms of labor that have traditionally been kind of devalued or invisible for one reason or another. Things like shift work in the gig economy, obviously very relevant to people in the film industry. And that's also something that we're going to come back and talk with some of our guests about. We've been thinking a lot about taking for granted where food comes from, and that the labor that is required to make every single individual piece of produce that you buy, which was an interesting connection too with Feast of the Epiphany, which, because Jeff, Michael and I have been talking about it and revisiting this film that we made some time ago. The whole second portion of the film takes place on a farm, and I feel like I'm looking, tell me if you feel the same, Jeff and Michael, but I feel like I'm looking with new eyes at some of the ways in which the people who labor on the farm, the issues around migrant work, about what's required to make organic farming work, this idea that like every sprig of spinach or whatever is like a miracle. I hope that we come to value those things again. And then also thinking that way about like domestic labor, about childcare and teaching and how you keep a home. And I think that intersects with another sort of theme that's come up for this week, which is work that's made by female identified filmmakers. I think a lot of these arenas have been devalued as kinds of labor because it's traditionally been assigned to women, work that women do. We're very lucky to have brought in people who can speak to both of these things. And I want to say a little about our guests. So the first person that we're going to be bringing on a little later is Nellie Killian, who's an amazing curator and put together a screening series at the Metrograph, I think in 2018, called Tell Me, which is films by and about women. It's an incredible slate of films that is now available for streaming on the Criterion channel. And a lot of the films do, of course, it's impossible to separate like that kind of identity or whatever your background is from the work that you do and the what's required of you in this world. Emma Piper-Burkett is a critic and filmmaker. She is often contributing to Reverse Shot, as well as Mayukh, who's a James Beard award-winning journalist who writes a lot about food and film, also a Reverse Shot contributor. We're in conversation this week on Reverse Shot for a weekly column that we're doing called Connected, where we ask one of our writers to speak to something that they've seen that week that stuck with them, and another of our writers will respond. So it's a way to have more of a dialogue than this like one stream review type format, which I know that a lot of us want. We want to find ways to be in meaningful dialogue with one another. And the films that they wrote about in that piece this week are Gas Food Lodging by Allison Anders and Daisies by Vera Chidilova. So we thought it was great how both of those films, again, speak to labor, are by female filmmakers, both of whom could and should get a lot more recognition for the work that they've made, and we're really excited to talk about that. Before we bring them on, though, I know, Michael, you had a very interesting sort of way of speaking to the labor theme that comes more from within our industry and some of the sort of ethics around film production, which we're also thinking and talking about a lot these days.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for all that. I mean, talking about how labor and work are represented on screen is something that we're very interested in. We'll be talking about today, but also the labor of filmmaking and what goes into filmmaking and the responsibility that we have and that filmmakers have to each other upon making films should not be taken for granted or forgotten about. And the only reason I'm thinking about that is because, and I'm sorry to bring up something that's like really difficult, actually, and I almost want to give a little disclaimer, that I was not given, as I will tell you in a second, that this is, that this dredges up, information that might be triggering or upsetting for people. But I'm sure everybody, this is an old story, but I'm sure not everyone might know, but many people listening to this might know the terrible story of what happened on the set Twilight Zone, the movie, way back in 1983. In which basically, the director John Landis, who was directing one segment of the film, it's an anthology film, had a very uncontrolled set, and through a series of very unfortunate and thoughtless occurrences, caused the death of the actor Vic Morrow and 2 children, Renee Chen and Micah Din Lee. This is something that I'd heard about my whole life. Like, I remember my parents talking about it. It was a big news story. So, but just recently, the channel Shudder, which is a horror movie streaming service, I've had this service for a while, and I really love horror movies, and I like to watch horror movies late at night after my husband's gone to bed because he doesn't want to watch them. So it's kind of a way for me to unwind. I know that sounds strange. For people who hate horror, this is like, why would you do this right now? But I do find it actually kind of cathartic and a release and somewhat comforting. So I was watching this original series that Shudder put on called Cursed Films, which, it plays off of all those stupid
phases of death and things.
Well, except that it was 5 episodes, and each one, it's a very major film. So it's like The Exorcist. It's like a half hour about The Exorcist, a half hour about Poltergeist. The Omen, like big movies that have all these, ridiculous stories floating around about cursed sets, when in fact all that happened was like actors on the set died a few years later, or someone said that the set was haunted by a demon. Stuff that's enjoyably inane, right?
Which is what you want at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever time.
That is what I want. I want to unwind and watch crap. But the last episode was about Twilight Zone, the movie, and I was really put off by the idea initially of this even being included in this series. Just the idea that this horrible accident, this very unavoidable accident, is somehow evidence of some sort of supernatural curse or some bullshit like that. But what really bothered me is that I'm sitting here watching this, and I'm already in a very fragile state. I think we're all in a pretty fragile state right now, and I didn't realize that the actual footage of what happened to these 3 people, including 2 children, existed. And I didn't realize that this footage was going to be shown to me on this show with absolutely no warning, no disclaimer. This is footage that I don't think should be shown to the public. That's just my belief. I believe that there are conversations being had about documentary ethics. But the fact that it was unleashed upon me as a viewer so quickly and without warning was extremely disturbing to me. And again, like, I've been sitting with this in my head. So my whole life, I think probably since I was 5 or 6, I've had an image in my head of what this must have looked like. It was a helicopter that crashed into these people and killed them. So I always had in my head what it looked like. But now I know what it looked like because they just showed the footage. And it was really very upsetting. I'll just say right now, I'm talking about this because it's well known that Landis and the production violated all kinds of child labor laws. Mm-hmm. They were making these children and this actor, Vic Morrow, who is actually Jennifer Jason Leigh's father, perform these stunts amidst these blasts, explosions happening all over as he drags these children through the water. You see the helicopter come down, go on them. I mean, it really is something that I will never forget. I'm very unhappy that I saw it. I canceled my subscription immediately to Shudder. I do not have the service anymore. And I actually want to say this is almost kind of a PSA to not watch that. Again, people can watch whatever they want, but as a warning, because I wasn't warned, there's actual footage of these deaths in this documentary, which was otherwise, a banal documentary. So stay away, everybody.
Yeah, we have to question the motivations of not only a subscription service that would put that into circulation without any sort of disclaimer, but also the film team who thought it was just okay to slide that material into what you call like an otherwise banal documentary. It's like it kind of beggars belief that was something that was allowed to happen.
Quite shameful, I would say. I'm sorry to sound like a taskmaster here, but I feel like I want people to know that that's there and to avoid it. And I don't want, right now, I mean, we have to pick and choose what we're giving our money to. So, and I'm sorry about all the, I'm sure, wonderful people who work there and who have done wonderful things for them. And I've enjoyed so many things on that channel, but I'm going to have to give it up for now.
Jeff,
Sorry.
I know you had an example of something that you've been watching and has actually been a building valuable experience in terms of, considering work.
Well, it's interesting too, because it's another project where folks have raised questions about activities on the set, and nothing quite so dire or literally deadly as what happened on Twilight Zone set. But I've been watching over the past few weeks the Alexander I will not be able to pronounce his name, Koresky,
That's it.
who made the Tao Project, which started out as a biopic about a Russian scientist, and somehow the production, and I'm still reading about how this happened, is swelled into 14 feature films that were shot over 3 years with people living in this huge set as if they were in communist Russia, in character all the time, shooting 24 hours a day. And I've now seen, I guess, four of the feature films of the 14 in the project. And I find myself increasingly intrigued by it as it goes along, as it can sort of like spins out its narrative and creates its, it's a Tao cinematic universe, if you will. Each new film adding new characters, taking place in different times, expanding the world, refracting different events that you've seen at different times through different perspectives. I'm quite curious about it, even as I learn more and I see more, I start reading more about the questions that have come, about the methods that have come to make it, and thinking about the labor costs that went into putting together, something like that. I can't imagine shooting for 3 years straight, 24 hours a day, having all these people at my behest all the time, just being in character. So it's something interesting that's happening in movies right now. The fact that they're releasing a new feature film every week online at Tao.movie, and it remains to be seen. There's still 10 movies to go, and I'm curious to see where I'm going to land with it once I've seen the entire project.
This is DAU, right?
DAU.movie.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think, though I know you are a particular lover of a marathon, Jeff.
That's a really controversial project. Yeah.
It is. Well, I think now is a great time to open up conversation with one of our guests. We'd love to bring back Nellie Killian.
Hi.
Hey, Nellie.
You found it.
I decided to put on the same headband that you're wearing. We're both wearing them, and I have been wearing them in a lot of my Zooms because my bangs are so long now because I can't get a haircut. And which is, the woman who cuts my hair, I'm sure it's the worker who cuts my hair.
Yeah, I've been thinking about kinds of work that is very specifically touch-based, and how we'll ever get to return to that, and that's like such a I don't know, sort of day-to-day part, again, like something that we take for granted on a pretty regular basis. So you can get a haircut, or
I had my first massage ever a few months ago. I guess that would be my first and last.
Yeah, you just got right in there.
No, we can get massages in the future. You just have to wear a full body trash bag.
Nice.
Well, Nellie, I'm really glad that you wore your headband in solidarity with me and my bangs issue. I really appreciate it. I think I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about the Tell Me series that's on, or select films from the Tell Me series that are available on Criterion Channel right now, because this has been an ongoing sort of dream series.
Yeah, it started at Metrograph in 2018, which was basically I was programming it in the fall, sort of in response to the various allegations that had come out against Harvey Weinstein and various people in the film industry and beyond. And it was, one of those moments where I feel like first off, reading, especially, I believe it was the New Yorker piece that just lists sort of story after story after story that these women were telling. And so many of them like hit the same beats, that like they called their mother, the sort of, years of recrimination, the sort of not, they all basically had the same argument with themselves and the same sort of cycle of self-blame and all of these things. And And almost all of them said something along the lines of like, I really didn't feel like anyone would understand or, would whatever. And I was like, but, it was so frustrating when that like actually people have told these stories before. And I had seen, in film, so many documentaries where women really like bared their soul and, talked about these feelings and like sort of gave a name to these things that then like, helps people understand their own experience. And the fact that that wasn't available was very frustrating in a moment when you were realizing how sorely it was really needed. And then the flip side of it was that there kind of became this sort of mantra almost of listen to women, which I'm a big proponent of listening to women, but it's not a chore or like something you do because, you want to hear like the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Like you should just listen to women because women are really interesting and half the population. And
fervent agreement.
Ralph agrees.
Yeah.
Ralph's like, that's right. Listen to it all.
Yeah. Interrupting.
You're the patriarchy, Ralph.
So again, like I had like, a lot of things that I was thinking about were, again, movies where women are giving these testimonies that are like really joyful or really just listening to a woman like Mimi in Claire Simon's movie give this kind of rambling 2-hour sort of, stories of her life and like giving you like a tour of all these spaces she's lived in and sort of like animating them with her memories, that there seemed to be something that was coming together with those two ideas. And one of the things that really connected them was the fact that a lot of the movies I was thinking of were movies directed by women where women were the subjects. Mm-hmm. That it was, there was more. There was a movie by a woman that was about how women feel about doing the laundry, which is a topic that, maybe this woman understood the sort of folklore and memory and sort of history that her mother passed down to her and how they did the laundry that might be somewhat invisible to people who haven't had to do laundry the way that these women did. So that ended up being the shape of the series. It's a series about women directors doing documentaries, talking to women subjects, and sort of what spaces that opens up. So it was at Metrograph in 2018, and on the 24th, the series page is going to launch on Criterion Channel, where most of the movies that were in that series, along with a couple more, will be available for streaming. They're actually all available for streaming now. If you go to the site, if you hear about anything today that you want to watch, you can definitely find it, but navigation will be very much easier on the 24th. And there'll also be a couple special features I'm excited about, including an interview with two of the founders of New Day Films, which was a collective filmmaking organization that a lot of the films in the series are from the New Day filmmakers, and also a conversation between me and my friend Jenny Slate, who watched all the films the first time around, and we sort of talk about the resonances.
That's good. I want to say how much I appreciate that you putting up Audience, the Barbara Hammer film. What an amazing movie. I've seen a lot of Barbara Hammer films. I'd never seen this one. And the space that it just gives for these women of the lesbian community in San Francisco, London, Toronto, and Montreal, I think.
Yeah.
Just speak about their experiences watching other films about lesbians. It's amazing. It's
really unique in her filmography, and like it's kind of surprises me it doesn't show more often, not just because I think rightly people really came to appreciate what a singular artist she was, but it's just kind of like an outlier in her filmography. But like it's also like one of the very few movies, there's an infinite amount of movies about people making movies. There are very few movies about people showing their movies to audiences, or that process of what it's like to actually have strangers react to your work. And it's just so singular in that regard. And she's such a perfect person to do it. I mean, she's so charismatic. It's like unreal.
Mm-hmm.
And what she's showing is such a unique experience for a lot of the women, this kind of like, you know, really moving to watch the films. But one thing that I find very moving is that the first section you see in San Francisco of women watching her films there, when you move on to the London scene, those women have watched the San Francisco women. So aside from them seeing Barbara's work, they're also getting this like glimpse into other communities around the world, and like being like, the women in San Francisco are so much freer. Like, you know, I feel like the culture here is different. And it's like this different type of exchange that's also just really great.
And now for us as a document to see these different communities that we haven't been able to see.
Well, and you're right, Nellie, in pointing out that we don't see that particular kind of exchange, or like that part of the process of filmmaking. Like when the film becomes part of the world, we don't get to have that recorded or reflect on it much, which is kind of crazy now that I think about it, because audiences and critics too spend so much time speculating about what filmmakers meant. And then filmmakers conversely, like either spend so much time speculating or just have these like, I think, emotionally driven conclusions about like, well, this is how people feel about my film. People get it or they don't get it. And it's like really based in very little actual dialogue.
Yeah. And I feel like it is especially, I mean, especially now, so many filmmakers are basically going on tour with their films, that it is like a big, like, it's a big part of the release, the, you know, entire production is this like sort of tail end.
Yeah.
I don't quite know why it's not considered cinematic, but
too much thinking, I guess. Too many words.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mechanics and the nuts and bolts for you of like putting together a series like this as a programmer. I mean, because I'm a viewer, not a programmer, and so these things, you know, appear at the Metrograph, and I see a list of films like this, and some of them which, you know, I've heard of before, some of which maybe I've seen, but a lot of which I wasn't aware of, frankly, in this series. And it's like, it's kind of almost like a Christmassy type feeling of like, it's unwrapping of this period, or this idea of film history that's different than things that I've normally been familiar with.
For a series like this, I mean, I've done a few series like this that are a little more archival, or take a different type of research. And you have like a constellation or certain movies that are maybe grounding your idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and then you start looking for more, you know, and the idea sort of shifts as you do that. And in this case, I had a number of movies I was thinking of, because like this idea was kind of, a number of movies were kind of central to, were just at the forefront of my mind and my reaction to everything that was happening, like most centrally really Chick Strand's Soft Fiction, which is a movie that I'd long wanted to have a larger audience. There was a restoration more than a decade ago, but it never, you know, was released like commercially or anything like that. So I guess I had like some notes about like what would be a series where I could like show Soft Fiction, that I'd already done some research, I guess, in that way. But you start thinking about like, well, where would I find these things? Like, and, you know, you end up Googling around, and, you know, then you find all of these flyers from women's film festivals in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you start like looking at all the titles and looking them up. You see, you know, realize that New Day Films has like a ton of movies, and then you start going through their catalog to see what else might fit. And in New York City, I mean, the resource that's really so fabulous is the New York Public Library, which their collection is incredible and really focuses on independent films in a very broadly defined way that includes a lot of educational films and a lot of documentary, a lot of films that were made in New York, a lot of films that were made by various artist collectives, and a lot of avant-garde film. And the librarians there are just incredibly knowledgeable. And like, I've, you know, now done a lot of research there over the course of like a decade, and, you know, having a good relationship with those librarians, Elena Rossi Snook in particular, you know, she's constantly like looking, she knows the collection so well and is constantly finding these connections too, that I can like, you can send her an idea of what you're thinking about, and she always has suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great. And then, you know, of course, then becomes like the thing of like paring down what.
Right.
And like, that's always hard. You know, there's always more to show than you want to show. And like, there's like a commercial limit to, I mean, you know, to like say to Metrograph, like, so it's just gonna be like all movies that are like between like 12 and like 43 minutes. And no one's going to have heard of any of them. And they were very supportive of the series, but you know, I mean, I'm not gonna ask for something that's totally outrageous. Yeah. So eventually you just have to be like, okay, like, you know, this is what it is. Like, how, like, is this like sort of covering the ground I want it to cover without like, you know, am I making room for all the things I want to show? And not, you know, just doubling up on things that I'm most interested in. And yeah, and then when I took it to Criterion, you know, it offered something that almost never happens when you program series, which is an opportunity to add some things later on. And Lila Weintraub's Shakedown was something I was able to add.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Today.
That's something I was able to add just in this iteration, along with Margaret Tate's Landmacher, which is something Penelope Bartlett suggested, which is also incredible. And also there was a film that was on Criterion's site, which, I mean, I think that's the other thing with programming is like working with what you got. And like they had I Am Wanda, which is a great documentary about Barbara Loden. And it, you know, it fit. It's a woman talking to Barbara about her process and her career and towards the end of her life. And it was like a great to be able to add that right in. And also to be able to direct people to Wanda, which is also on the Criterion channel. And it's a great example of a fiction movie that is really invested in a woman's perspective in a different way. Yeah.
It's great. It's like this network of films that all deserve more attention. And it's nice to be able to like set that up. And I think it'd be great to talk about some of the films that do specifically deal with labor, because there's quite a few. But also had a kind of a question about like the labor of the filmmakers involved. And, you know, like speaking as a female filmmaker myself, one of the things that was really, it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but I was certainly reminded again and again, seeing films in the series the first time and now revisiting with Criterion, that there are like kinds of experimentation with form, kinds of pushing boundaries of filmmaking that these women never get talked about. So like Chickstrand Soft Fiction is a great example. I think it's like seminal documentary and just does not get enough attention. And I just can't help but feel that that's in part because of, you know, the identity of the filmmaker, or a film like Finding Krista that's like really experimenting with the fiction, nonfiction line, bringing in her personal stories. It has a totally like radical attitude about structure. You can shift off into a totally different mode, and she has such a like masterful way of holding on to the cohesion of the film total. And like I felt thrilled to see the movies, but also often angry, like, why hasn't anybody told me about these before?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes, and I'm sure you guys all feel this way too, like you know enough about film that like things are very familiar to you.
Sure.
And like to me, like Chickstrand died I think like 15 years ago, and there is a big retrospective of her work, which I saw all of it, and it was, you know, an attempt to kind of like reposition her as like one of these major foundational avant-garde filmmakers, which I just took as the gospel truth, and like, you know, moved forward in my life being like, yes, Chickstrand is up there with like Stan Brakhage. And then like you realize over time, it's like, oh, no one, people really don't know her the way that they should. Like I was lucky enough to be able to like dip into a different narrative where she's more central to everyone's understanding.
Yeah.
But, you know, she's an interesting, I think a lot of these women are interesting because, I mean, I think in order for women to make films, period, but also for them to be making the type of work, this personal type of work, like, I mean, I guess they all are like really taking the subjects on their own terms. Like in Suzanne, the Camille Billops, there's this moment where it moves from, like you were saying, like from documentary to sort of a staged catharsis between the mother and daughter. And like, it's her family. So the intervention is very natural, you know, in a way that I think might not be. It doesn't feel like some big swooping like directorial statement so much as the right way to proceed in this movie about material that she's so close to, which is just like I mean, you know, what a way to be experimenting with form. But it's talked about more in terms of this personal connection rather than how radical it is, which it is, I mean, which is like very gendered. You know, if she had like come out and been like, I'm like experimenting with form, you know,
exactly.
But like, that's not how it was positioned, you know?
Right.
Exactly. She just did the thing that made the most sense to her at the time. And it doesn't need to be about like, well, I'm going to, you know, well, here's the master narrative of how form is supposed to function. So here I am going to break it.
I mean, Leanne Brandon actually talked about that in our interview for Criterion, where she talks about how she had these 2 takes for Betty Tells Her Story, and like spent like a year trying to figure out how to edit them together, and then ended up deciding on just like a hard cut, and the story just unfolds twice. You see the first take and then the second, and it ends up being like basically a very experimental documentary about like you know, like documentary performance and like intimacy, and the way people tell themselves stories, the way people construct narratives, the way people hide emotion through narrative, you know, like all these things. And I forget who it was, but she said that she like took it to someone who was at MIT at the time, not Robert Gardner, but so, you know, one of these big Boston filmmakers, and like showed it to him, and they were like, you did absolutely everything. Like you broke every rule and did everything like the way that you're not supposed to. And it's perfect. Like, you know, it was just like, figured out how to do it. And it was like completely not, and he said something like, it's lucky you didn't go to film school.
Wow.
Because they would have taught you not to do this.
Right.
I think that this is actually a really great point because of the films that they wrote about this past week to bring in our 2 other guests, Mayukh Sen and Emma Piper-Burkett.
Yeah, they wrote a connected column, which I will paste into the chat window for people who want to read it. It's a really great iteration of this experiment we've been doing on reverse shot. Hi, guys.
Welcome, guys. Thanks
Hi.
for your patience. Thanks for being here.
I think just carrying over a little bit from what we were talking about with Nellie, something that struck me in the writing about the film Gas, Food, Lodging by Allison Anders was, you know, why haven't, considering the sort of skill and beauty of this film, like why didn't this person get to continue to make films? And I was wondering if you could speak to that thought as you were watching.
Yeah, it's really odd because so Allison Anders, you know, she's also directed movies like Grace of My Heart, that was really good in the 90s, but now a lot of her work is on TV, you know, and it's really odd to me considering how, you know, she had such a great start in the late 80s and early 90s with movies like Gas, Food, Lodging. And she got all these awards, you know, if we're looking purely by like the metrics of, you know, success within the film industry or whatever, she got like New York Film Critics Circle, like, you know, Best New Director Award, National Society of Film Critics, the Independent Spirit Awards, when that really meant something. You know, she got all those nominations and stuff. So you'd think that this film and, you know, the woman behind it would be kind of written into history a bit more, but, you know, she wasn't for some reason. And I think that part of it might just have to do with the fact, honestly, that this movie itself, like, I think stylistically, it's the kind of movie that people can write off as like, oh, it's like a scrappy indie movie from the 90s, you know? Like, I was actually thinking of this other movie, not by Allison Anders, but it's called Ruby in Paradise, and it was like an early Ashley Judd movie. And that's also kind of like similarly like forgotten and buried, and I just like don't really know why, except it's like the subject matter, the fact that it's like female-centric and female-focused. Yeah, I think that's a big thing because, you know, what's her face? Allison Anders' like whole narrative orientation is like, you know, usually towards women. And in this case, it's like a family of working class women, you know. So yeah, I feel like that is kind of a big reason why it's been forgotten in some way.
And could, like what you just said about, you know, this is about working class women,
Yeah.
and they're sort of like economic survival. I was wondering if you could speak to that, you know, and this sort of like labor theme for the week. It was particularly interesting to me that you, as someone who writes about food and film, that confluence of thinking about like how the depiction of like where the food ends up, how it's done, and that this is not a movie, you know, you wrote about how this is not a movie about like the sensual pleasures of food. It's like a piece of work that needs to occur in a way.
Right, exactly. So just a bit of background, like the reason why I decided to write about this movie is because I spent the first few months of 2020 like programming the series for BAM on like food and film, but it was basically like reframing the way that we see food on film, you know? So, you know, I think like Alton Brown at Metrograph a few years ago did something with like Tampopo and like Babette's Feast and Big Night, all these like classic food movies, you know? And those are mostly great movies, you know, but I didn't want to do anything like that. I wanted to be like, okay, food can be about so much more than like, you know, pleasure, you know, there's so many great depictions of disordered eating on film and, you know, food labor and service work, etc. And those stories need to be told and, you know, they need to be seen as food movies. And so Gas Food Lodging was kind of in this day that I had that was all about like waitressing on film. So it was alongside like Support the Girls, which is a wonderful movie. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore by Scorsese. Mildred Pierce, like the old one, not the remake. Yeah, but it's funny because I think out of all those 13 movies that I selected, Gas Food Lodging, like you really got to squint to like find the actual food in there. Like, you know, there are like 2 scenes, you know, like I think you see a sandwich at some point. Otherwise, it's like, you know, you just got to pay attention to like what the characters order when they're in a diner. But
it's in the title. It's Gas Food and Lodging. It's in the title.
I know, what a tease, right? It's like you'd think that it's more about food, but in actuality, there's not a lot of food there. But what it is about is this, you know, so there's a woman named, God, what is her name? Nora. And she lives in this New Mexico town called Laramie, and she's played by Brooke Adams, and she is a waitress at a truck stop diner, and she has 2 teenage daughters, one named Trudy, and the other is named Shade, and Shade is played by Firuza Balk, who's incredible in the movie. But yeah, it's just about like the day-to-day lives of like, you know, being in a working class family, and, you know, they don't have a father figure within their lives. You know, there's no male identifying person within that family unit, you know? So it's truly about like working class female survival. So yeah, I mean, I really love that movie. And I think that within the lineup of like, you know, all those food movies, whatever, that I created at BAM, like I think that would be the film that kind of pushes viewers most to like, you know, think about, you know, what does it mean to like, I don't know, honor the people who bring our food to us being consumers in this case, you know, because that kind of labor is so often overlooked, both in terms of like, you know, traditional storytelling, like in journalism, you know, as a food journalist, you know, very few publications are willing to run stories on, you know, the life of a waitress or day-to-day, you know, like what that actually means and entails, you know. I think now because of the pandemic, like some people, I think, who are gatekeepers within the food media industry are becoming more attuned to the realities of, you know, working within the food industry, but they certainly weren't very much before, you know. But I also think that not many films really honor that kind of labor either, you know, which is why I really wanted to focus on this movie.
I feel like one of the most indelible scenes in Gas Food Lodging is when I think the daughters go to the diner and you don't yet know the relationship to the waitress and they order from her.
Yeah.
And they're being like brat to their mom, but like it just seems like they're being really rude to the waitress.
Totally.
But they're also really rude to their mom. And like also like what they order is really interesting, and it is like a really telling moment. I feel like you learn so much about those girls just from what they order at the diner.
Yeah, exactly. I think like Shade, the younger one, she orders a BLT and like a large glass of slice with ice or something like that. And then the other one, Trudy, the older one, she orders like a salad or something like that. You know, she has a date later that night. Yeah, it's a totally heartbreaking movie. And, you know, I think that there are some signs that Alison Anders is gaining more appreciation within the general public. You know, like Criterion Channel like ran a feature on her, I think last month or at least a few weeks ago, you know, so I think that's kind of pushed the movie back in the conversation a tiny bit, but still, you know, it deserves more viewers. It deserves more love. It's really like, it's heartbreaking.
Okay, I was gonna say, Emma, how did you arrive at Daisies from Gas Food Lodging?
I think there was something, I mean, I think it was from Shade's character and like just having that escape from the movies and thinking about, I mean, really thinking about like my own experience as a teenage girl. And I think I related a lot to her and like the way that she would sort of observe and internalize things. And there was like, I was still a teenager when I saw Daisies for the first time. And I think when I saw it, it was just this, like, it was like suddenly all these things that I had felt inside, I was seeing being played out on screen in this really fantastic way of like, there's like the joy and the dress up and the chaos and like that really fun part of being like a young girl. But then there's also like that extreme weight of what you're up against constantly. And so I think, yeah, that was kind of where my mind was going as I was watching, because yeah, I hadn't seen Gas Food Lodging before, and it was such a treat to get to see it.
I'm glad you liked it.
And it's interesting as it's like just a much more explosive response to like kind of having to work within the capitalist system. And it's funny how both of these movies like are secretly about that in every vein, but respond so differently.
I keep thinking about, I didn't write about it, but like that last scene where after they've like they've had the food fight and kind of destroyed everything on the table, and they're putting everything back together in this really grotesque and like obviously not effective way of like, but they're like, oh, we're so efficient and we're working so hard and we feel so happy. And there was something about like that mantra that just kept being repeated and repeated, and I felt like I was like, oh wow, that's like how we are right now, like that thing of like that drive for productivity and how you tell yourself like, oh, if I do this I'll feel good and we'll be happy, and like, but it's so hollow. And I think this whole quarantine time has really called that to light, just like the hollowness of the push that I feel like has been like this accelerated thing lately. So
yeah, that reassembling of the trashed meal into this kind of perversion of its form, something that I think about a lot actually. I love Daisies. I've seen it many times.
Yeah.
I always anticipate that final sequence, the kind of food, the sequence that actually made the film so controversial that the Czech film government banned it. The Czech government banned the film on charges of food wastage, which I think is really fascinating. I'm actually curious because you kind of just slide this into your piece ever so casually. You studied film at FAMU,
I did.
which is the National Film School of Prague, where Vera Chytlova studied, and all the great filmmakers. It was established in 1946. It's where all the great Czech New Wave filmmakers studied.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, she had just retired like a year or two before I got there, but my mentor, one of my mentors, was her student, and so there was like a nice feeling of this sort of continuity. And I think because I loved that film so much, and I had this idea of just like this total freedom, I think I was actually surprised by how actually like much we really like were drilled in with narrative structure and like this sort of like, it was like a very different approach to what I was kind of expecting to be able to interact with. And so I felt a little bit, and I think a lot about what you were speaking about earlier about just like these things where you do what feels internally right and people tell you it's wrong. And I think I came up with that a lot. Like with every assignment, I would kind of just do my thing and they would be like, but this doesn't like make logical sense. And I'd be like, yeah, but it goes together. And they would be like, yeah, you're right, it does. But it was kind of like this, it was this funny thing where I felt like I was going back to something that was there, but it had gone in this more like very strict narrative way that I wasn't quite prepared for. And I actually felt really blocked by, like in terms of writing scripts or things like that. Like I felt like it took me a while to sort of realize that I didn't have to follow those things that I was being told I needed to follow. But I think the thing that I really loved about it, I mean, like all of our assignments, we could shoot things on film, and there was like the Barrendorf studios where like all those Czech films in the 60s were made, was where we would send our film to get just like developed, and we would go to the prop room, and that's where we would get all of our stuff. And there was something that just felt so amazing about being able to be part of that lineage. And it is also very close because it's, you know, it's a small country and everybody kind of knows each other, and there's just like definitely that sense of history that you're part of. That was really cool. Yeah.
Very exciting. Sorry, go ahead, Farihah.
Well, I just wanted to say, but like as we're approaching the end of our happy hour, I think it would be remiss to move on without talking about one of the films that you programmed, Nellie, Joyce at 34, because it's such a perfect literal encapsulation of our themes this week. It's about work and giving birth and the shit that women have to do. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Amazing.
Joyce 34 is a film that Joyce Chopra co-directed with Claudia Wheel. Joyce Chopra directed Smooth Talk with Laura Dern, which you might have seen, and Girlfriends is the film that I think Claudia is best known for. And, the two of them made this film, Joyce at 34, which, sorry, I'm just plugging in my computer. Joyce is having her first child, and it's interesting, like, they're making this film together about how Joyce is going to sort of integrate motherhood into her professional life. And I just saying that out loud, that is exactly like how they're conceiving of it. Like, how am I going to just like, how's this baby going to fit? And it's such an incredible movie, in part because at first there's like a little bit of almost like ambivalence that like, it isn't, I don't know, before she gives birth, she's talking about how it feels like this like delayed film project that's like never going to get off the ground. And eventually, you know, she has the child and goes back to work. And, you know, it becomes this thing of, you know, she can leave the baby with her mother, she can leave the baby with her husband, or she can try and take the baby with her when she goes and shoots in a different city. And she, you know, runs into the thing that sort of is very universal, of that there is actually no way to balance it. And she sort of convenes a round table of her mother and their peers talking about the ways that they confronted this, that all these women worked, but they worked jobs that accommodated the schedule of their children. And then she talks to women her age, and they talk about delaying having children or deciding maybe not to have children because they don't see how it can work. And, you know, what's amazing about it is that as she's sort of talking through like these various hurdles, like she's just also continuing to work and continuing to be a mother. Yeah. And her husband is learning about housework, basically, and is like, you know, totally like a great partner to her. But it's very interesting that it is this very like 70s new woman, new man thing. And he's like, you know, I hate going to the grocery store, but I guess she hates going to the grocery store too. So now not who goes to the grocery store.
And it's better that I go to the grocery store than we just fight about it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, it's a really beautiful film. And I don't know what more to say about it, but it is like it's amazing how it's like completely, like, it doesn't seem like any of this conversation has changed at all.
And one of the things that I related to and appreciated is how cut and dried it is. Like, it's not a film that's smart and layered because there's a lot of like apparatus around it. It's somehow smart and layered, even though she's telling you what is happening and how she feels at every minute. And it's like, as a result, also so true to the tell me theme, right? Yeah. She's like allowed to just say what's happening. And I'm like, I was reminded, like, I so rarely get to hear women talk about this in a public way.
And she has like very complicated feelings about all of it. You know, she comes to realize that it's very difficult for her to leave her child to work. And, you know, that wasn't something I don't think she expected. And like, you know, sort of dealing with that and dealing with being emotional about it when she's, you know, away shooting something in New York is like, you know, it's all like very heavy. But also it's like, it's done in this really light way. I mean, of course, like all of the, you know, Joyce is incredible, but like all of the women who are talking are also like all of her mother's friends. Like I could have watched that scene for like an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know.
Jeff, you worked on a labor film very recently with one of the filmmakers in the Tell Me series, Julia Reichert.
Well, it's funny.
Aunt and mentor.
As I was watching Joyce at 34, I was thinking, Jesus Christ, this is Julia. And the kid is Leela. And, you know, knowing them and knowing their trajectory through life and seeing how Julia has tried to balance being a mom and is still balancing being a mom. She's in her 70s now, but still she's a mom and a filmmaker, and there were responsibilities to both of those things. It was interesting to see that play out in a time like, you know, I didn't know Julia right when she'd had Leela, because we were, you know, I was 1.5 years old at that point, so I couldn't see it, but I could imagine her making those same kinds of choices.
Look who just appeared.
Eric.
Magic.
Hynes from the Museum of the Moving Image.
This has been great.
Do you have a favorite labor film that you've been kind of revisiting mentally or actually?
Sprung this on me.
I think the Cheers conversation that we talked about at the end of the first happy hour, actually, I truly have thought throughout the hour that it really applies.
Not that we have to talk about Cheers forever, but I wanted you to see, Eric, that I've replaced the magazine cover this week with the Ted Danson I Went Nuts This Year. So last week we had Jason Patrick. This week we have Ted Danson. In case anyone wants to go independently research just exactly how Ted Danson went nuts back in 1993, that's up to you. I'm not going to tell on this pod. Oh, it's not a podcast. What is this?
It's worth reading.
It's worth reading about. I just don't want to get anyone in trouble.
No.
Years later.
What happened to Ted Danson that year? Absolutely.
What's going on with the museum, Eric? What's up? What are you guys doing?
I mean, related to especially with some of the stuff we've been talking about recently here in the hour, and what Mayukh was talking about is on Monday, Sonia Epstein, our associate curator of science on screen and the editor of the Sloan Science and Film website, has an event on Monday called Dirty in the Kitchen, Yeast and Bread Making with Avery Rizika and Nicholas Money. And so there's going to be discussion, there's going to be archival films, there's going to be some of Nicholas Money's films about sort of the science of food and growth, and then also there's going to be an opportunity to get your hands dirty and make along with the participants. So that'll be very unique, definitely the first ever museum-related Dirty in the Kitchen event. And then I think the other thing that's really worth bringing up is we've collaborated for the first time with MoMI, the great streaming service that sort of emphasizes curation in its streaming, not to make it all by Criterion today. But they came to us and collaborated with us on the First Look Festival, the festival that almost happened or sort of happened this year.
Almost happened.
And it continues to go in the sense that they've taken 4 films from this year's First Look and are presenting them this month, and they're doing week by week. And so at the moment, and I think you can get a free month for free, and if you're a museum member, you get 3 months for free. So these are all just available to you if you sign up today, which is No Fee is up, and Transnistria went up this week, and in the next 2 weeks, Searching Eva and Bird Talk are all going up onto MoMI, and they're all fantastic films that we did not get a chance. We showed some films we did not get a chance to show these for, so please go to MoMI for that.
Great.
Actually, you know what? I have a movie that I didn't end up showing in Tell Me, but it's a food movie that I can send if you guys want to send it to everyone afterwards. I'll find it.
Do it.
But it.
You can also put it in the chat if
really,
you want to put it out.
I'm gonna find it. I'll put it in the chat.
But just quickly, labor films, the film that I've not revisited yet that I want to in the coming weeks for the reasons that some related to some of what we discussed, but also just because I'm nostalgic and upset by the loss of baseball, which is 8 Men Out. The John Sayles, John Sayles is a fantastic filmmaker about labor, and 8 Men Out is a really, really significant film, I think, and a significant sports film, because this is just, nobody ever has conversations about sports and finds effective ways of dramatizing the labor that goes behind the scenes, and it's a great film. So I look forward to revisiting that in the coming weeks.
And can I ask, since we're here, because I know later I will send him a note asking, so I might as well do it here in front of everybody. Mayukh, not to put you on the spot, but what's a film, because I know Gas Food Lodging was such an interesting choice as a film that's, even the word food is in the title, but it's not really about food, as you say, it's about different kind of labor. What's a good example of a food movie? Maybe it's something that you had programmed even in the series that is about the labor, but it's about the labor of cooking, about the preparation of the food.
Like a chef. Let me look at my list real quick. I mean, actually, Jean Dielman is like, obviously Jean Dielman deals with like a domestic rather than a restaurant cook or chef. But I think that was one of the lead movies of my series. And I think that did a really good job of just kind of like showing the absolute tedium of making meatloaf and, all the other stuff that she makes before she screws up the potatoes. So
the most devastating to a sever. Just that she burns the potatoes.
Exactly. Yeah, I won't spoil. Yeah.
Does anyone have anything cooking right now as we're speaking?
Probably you.
Oh, right. You've got something back on the grill. I mean, just to circle back to the work of our industry before we have to say goodbye, I was wondering, Nellie, if you could mention the Cinema Workers Fund, which was really amazing and quick acting support for theater workers in New York City.
Yeah, I was talking before everything shut down, sort of in the week leading up to the shutdown. I'd been chatting with Sierra Pettengill and Thomas Beard and Ed Halter about how, we were anxious that things weren't closing down fast enough. And, it became a thing where, you don't want to cavalierly be like, shut it down when you know that that's just putting everyone out of work. But also it was like, this is just getting like really ridiculous. Like, we need to go home. And it sort of became a thing where we were like, well, there's no win here. And when finally all the theaters did start to shut down, we were like, well, why don't we just do like a GoFundMe and see if we can raise some money for people who get laid off? And, it got a lot of traction and we raised $80,000, which is incredible. But in the sort of 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks that it was up, the demand was just so outrageous. We left it open to any laid off hourly film worker in the city, theater worker, people who were in venues that were shutting down. And, we eventually had to cut off the application form because we wanted to make sure that we were able to give people a significant amount of money. And if, we just let it open, we might have only given people like $5. The amount was just outrageous, like, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of wages that just like weren't going to be paid in the immediate. And for like a week's wages. And it did take a long time for things to snap into place for people. I mean, things are getting better now, but like it really was like such a time of absolute unknowns. It was really great how people stepped up, most giving like about the amount of money that would cost to go to a movie. And we were able to give $225 to each of to about 300 applicants. Which was great. And another great thing that happened was cities all around the country reached out and said that they wanted to do something similar for the workers in their cities. And a lot of those efforts are still alive. I know the Chicago Cinema Workers Fund is still accepting donations. And there were ones, there was one in Vancouver, I think, and one in Los Angeles, one in Seattle. So it's great. I mean, it's the difficult thing, right? Where it's great that like that model is available and people can raise money, but of course, like, that's not what's needed. What's needed is an actual safety net for people and an actual like, the security of being taken care of like in an official way and not like through the sort of $10 at a time from people who can afford it. But still like the generosity is really incredible.
Yeah. I thought it really showed our community come together, and it was, like you said, interesting to see people who I know also have their own uncertainties, but and yes, like we all wish that we didn't have to take care of this issue with a donation-based system, but like if we have to, in the meantime, we will. So thanks for that work, and thinking of other, you know, people like us working in film, at home from productions, at home from closed theater venues, figuring out when their next gig is going to be. Like, we are with you.
You should raise a glass to all those workers.
We're literally with you.
I want a quick shout out while we do this, to invite folks to join us in raising a glass. I want to particularly thank David Schwartz and Edo Choi of the museum, who actually worked with me on what was supposed to be a Chantal Ackerman series last weekend for Mother's Day weekend, where we would have shown John Dielman. So I want to thank them out there, but also want to quickly call out, because it's so wonderful to see you all, the reverse shot writers who are out there, which is, I'm sure I'm going to miss some because some are lurking and are going right. But if you are bold enough to use your own name, I want to thank you for joining us. Caden Gardner, Chloe Lazat, Chris Wisniewski, Genevieve Yu, Imogen Smith, Jordan Kronk, Ryan Swen, Susanna Gruder, Andrew Chan, and Nicholas Rapold. Thank you all.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks so much. Cheers, y'all. Bye.
See you next week. We'll be here.
Next week.